Here we are again, Dr. Lee Coleman, and thanks again for being here. Last time I introduced this topic, which came to me pretty much out of the blue in the end of 1984. And it gradually took over a huge part of my work, and for 30 years I was into it up to my you-know-what because of more and more cases in which, after having studied a case of somebody being accused of sexually molesting a child, I saw information, ideas, theories, testimony from mental health professionals which was completely founded on poor ideas. And even more important, I saw methods in the police and child protection communities which I could see immediately were drawn from my profession. I'm a mental health professional, a psychiatrist. But when I use the term psychiatry or mental health professions, now I'm not just limiting it to psychiatry. We're talking about psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, other kinds of therapists who have mental health credentials. But I began to see theories and methods and testimony and reports from them which were taken, which were influencing police work and the work of the investigative community. So keep that in mind. We have mental health professionals practicing therapeutic things and conducting interviews, and then we have investigative professionals, police and child protection social workers. Two different communities, but both of them using a mental health ideology, which I'm going to explain to you, so that the investigative community got corrupted because they assumed that the mental health community knew what they were talking about. And the mental health community got corrupted by taking on a task of the investigative community. Now that is a little bit shorthand. I'm only telling it to you now as an introductory teaser. I'll go on to explain in much more detail. But that's what came to me and took over such a big part of my work until very recently when I pretty much retired. But we need to go back a step. Somebody has said, if you want to understand what's happening now, and you want to try to look to the future and do things better, you better start looking to the past first. Because where else can you look? History. So many times, if you don't study history, you're just all in a mess in terms of understanding what's going on. So, the child sexual abuse prevention movement is our topic. The child sexual abuse prevention movement came from a more general movement, the child abuse prevention movement. Obviously, I hope it's obvious, we all want to protect children from abuse. If that is not what you're interested in, please turn off your computer or go somewhere else on your computer. I have nothing to say to you that will do you any good. And believe me, I've been accused in court of lawyers of somehow wanting to help the people who have an interest in being able to molest children. If you have anything in your mind other than the subject of helping to protect children from abuse, please don't watch me, because I have nothing to say that will help you. You're wasting your time. The general topic is the protection of children from abuse. But it's supposed to also be within the context of justice. You cannot protect children from abuse unless you find the truth first. And as I'm going to be talking quite regularly, if you do a bad job of finding out the truth of whether or not a child has been abused by any kind of abuse, then you yourself as an investigator are going to become one of the abusers. And if you think that only people who hit children, batter children, or sexually engage a child in some way, that's the only way you can abuse a child. Let me tell you, there's a lot of other ways. And if you are involved in the process of finding out, supposedly, whether a child was abused, and you get it wrong because of the wrong kind of thinking, the wrong kind of methods, whether you like it or not, you are becoming one of the abusers. Now, that's a very serious thing to say, and I wouldn't say it if I was not prepared to back it up. So the way we want to start is to look at the child abuse prevention movement and then move to the child sexual abuse prevention movement, because that's exactly the way it evolved. And as I said in a very early session on, and again, this may be a review to some degree, I happen to be in the very facility where I saw that happening. The child abuse prevention movement really was an outgrowth of what came to be called a recognition of the battered child syndrome. Some of you will already know that term if you have a professional background. A nurse, a teacher, certainly doctors, nurses, and so forth. The battered child syndrome was the recognition by the Department of Pediatrics and the Department of Psychiatry of the University of Colorado Medical Center. Dr. Henry Kemp, a pediatrician, and Dr. Brant Steele, a psychiatrist. But Dr. Henry Kemp, more than any other person, because the major understanding came from a recognition that children who were being seen by the medical the facilities of the University of Colorado Medical Center, where I was a resident in psychiatry. I started in the Department of Psychiatry in 1965. I think they had already done some work before I got there, but they were still developing and their material coming together. It was beginning to be recognized in pediatrics. I remember as though it were yesterday, sitting in radiology class. They're flashing on the screen the pictures showing us signs of fractures, dislocations, injuries that were being recognized for the first time as a sign of traumatic injury, not a sign of medical disorder, not a sign of developmental disorder, a sign that someone or something had created trauma. So they gradually developed a recognition. This is something that as medical doctors, we need to make sure other doctors find out about that. We need to create a way of getting that information out to society. We have a justice system and a police network which doesn't even think about this, is not ready to respond to it. An entire movement needed to be developed so that children could be protected and that justice could be done. People who harm children cannot be allowed to do that. Now, you can have a moral precept in society, but that is no substitute for crime and punishment. If you cause harm to somebody else, there is a system to hold you accountable. That means courts, that means police, that means verdicts, guilty, innocent, and punishment. As we're going to see in a minute, the doctors, especially when we get to the mental health part of this, we're not ready to confront the reality that if you're going to find people have done such a thing to a child, we need a system of punishments for it. And I've never been soft on that subject. All right, so the University of Colorado, we now have good medical information when children are being the subject of trauma, non-accidental injury. That can mean deliberate assault by somebody. It can mean an accident but due to neglect, and that's also against the law. That is not something that's permitted. That means we need a criminal justice system. But first we must find the truth. So I was there to see it, and there was not any reason at that point that I could see, or that anybody really talked about, other than full speed ahead. Let's get the information out. Books started to be written. Gradually, emergency departments began to be ready to have police that they could call. Police began to be ready to respond. Before that, people didn't really know quite what to do if you had medical information, let's say film or bleeding that looked suspicious. You don't just lightly bring up the subject with a parent that might imply that you think they might have done something to their own child if you don't have agencies ready and comfortable with interviewing people. Possibly in starting a process where the child is not allowed to stay at home for a while. That might be necessary. Tremendous number of things that needed to be done. The system took time to start developing that. Well, the system developed to the point where, I don't know how many years you'd say, it was a gradual process. It certainly didn't happen in a year or two, but eventually laws were passed. Every state developed agencies which were ready to respond. Child protective agencies already existed, but they were not anywhere ready for what became a very well-known phenomenon of the physical abuse or neglect of children. Okay. By the time that I had left Colorado, left the University of Colorado Medical Center, 1969, I then moved on to my 2 years in the Air Force, which was part of my military obligation. Everybody would be drafted. In my case, as a doctor, they deferred the draft until you had all your training completed. That way you'd go into the military but serve in your specialty. So I was a psychiatrist at the United States Air Force Academy from July 1969 to June 1971. But the subject of abuse of children really didn't come up to any significant extent, maybe occasionally. And I continued my work in psychiatry in ways that I've already been talking about until we get to the end of 1984. And I saw a few children in a therapy context where the child had been abused by somebody in one way or the other, but it was never a situation where it was a contended issue. It had already been handled by some agencies, and I was not part of this process of examining someone else's report on whether it happened or not. So the experience that I began to get toward the end of 1984 was very different, and the kind that I've mentioned, that an accusation was made of sexual abuse, and there was some kind of legal proceeding going to happen to decide, did this happen? If so, who did it? And what was society going to do? Okay. We then are ready to move into this subject of how the system of investigating whether a child had been sexually abused. We've moved from the general topic of abuse or neglect of children, but not in a sexual way. And that's where the mental health system got brought into the investigative system. That's where we're going for the next session. This is a little bit of a long build-up, but it's worth it because there is a tremendous system of injustice right now. Children are being harmed. People are being unjustifiably accused and sometimes convicted. I would estimate that there are thousands of innocent people in prison right now on this topic alone. Come back and we're done with the preliminaries. We'll be ready to move into how the child sexual abuse field evolved. We're going to start with a program called the Child Sexual Abuse Let's see, let me refresh my memory. CSATP. It was Henry Giarretto, the author of Integrated Treatment of Child Sexual Abuse, a treatment and training manual from the Juvenile Probation Department of Santa Clara County, California. Come back and we'll talk about that, and thanks very much for coming.